But I think when this first came out, because I'm old enough to remember that, I think that's how some people perceived it. Oh, Bobby Dylan, now he's going to come to church in a tie and, give his testimony to everybody about he was saved from rock and roll or something. And, that never really happened. And within a few years, he was on to other things. But he did leave a good album. Everybody, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to talk a little bit about this album, Bob Dylan, Slow Train Coming, and there were a couple other albums that were kind of part of this little coterie of albums he did in the late 70s and early 80s. And I have vinyl copies of all three. And of course, these are the albums that are associated with Bob Dylan's very famous conversion to born-again Christianity, which I'm old enough to remember very well. So I thought I'd share some of my personal memories and reflections on that, as well as a little review of this album. I hope you'll consider watching. Well, they say you should play to your strengths. And I feel like I'm starting to sound like a broken record when I say that there aren't very many advantages to getting older, but there are a few. And one of them is I have good memory now, and I can remember a lot of things that other people have to read about in Wikipedia or on a book. And one of them is in the late 70s. I think I was just getting out of high school, maybe that around that age. And Bob Dylan converted to Christianity, and it was also evangelical born-again Christianity, and born-again Christianity was kind of a 70s term, and I remember it being fairly specifically used with Bob Dylan, that he'd become born again. And I thought that was kind of interesting. That term born again, I think, was kind of a 70s thing. I don't hear it that much anymore. Just a little Christianity. So I didn't want to get too much into the weeds of all those sort of culture war issues, other than to say it was born again Christianity. I remember that pretty specifically, and that was a really interesting thing in the 70s. And I think the 80s, in the Reagan years, a lot changed, and I think it's hard to remember the 70s in some ways because the country changed so much in the 80s and beyond. But in the 70s, Jimmy Carter ran as a born-again Christian. I remember people had that "I found it" sign they would put on their doors. And he got a lot of, he was a Democrat, and he got a lot of what was left of the anti-war vote, the McGovern vote. A lot of the people you would associate at that time with being Democrats. He also got an endorsement from Pat Robertson, who, went on to become kind of, what a lot of people think of him today. But he got an endorsement from Pat Robertson. And so Jimmy Carter was sort of a person of born-again Christianity at that time, and he was kind of a Democrat. And Jimmy Carter was, in a lot of ways, pretty socially and culturally conservative. I think a lot of his views, even today, are pretty socially and culturally conservative. I've actually had dinner with Jimmy Carter once, and I met him a couple other times. But at one time, I had a little dinner with Jimmy Carter, just me and three other people, at the Carter Center in Atlanta, and I'll always say good things about Jimmy Carter, the man. And he is a fine man. But that album, Slow Train Coming, kind of came out at the end of the Carter 70s, the Jimmy Carter 70s. A lot of people remember the gas lines and the malaise and so on, but that was actually a pretty good time, but that born-again Christianity was sort of associated with the Carter era in a way. And, that to kind of finish that thought, Jimmy Carter was endorsed by Pat Robertson, and he was also endorsed by Greg Allman and Willie Nelson, And I think Billy Graham liked Jimmy Carter pretty well, too. So our country was pretty different back then. Nowadays, I guess if you put those people in the same room, the chances are they wouldn't agree on what color the sky was, maybe, But I think that's kind of refreshing in a way. And maybe we didn't have, I don't know. It just seems like our country was so different then. I was, a kid in my teen years, really, but I remember it really well. And there were a lot of good things about that period, including kind of a more open system, I think, in some ways. And Dylan came out of that. And when he did this album, he was kind of coming out of what might be my favorite period of Dylan, which I guess they sometimes call it the ramshackle period. But that would be like Blood on the Tracks and Desire. And Blood on the Tracks might be one of the greatest albums I've ever heard in my life. And Dylan's got some good ones. And then I think he did Street Legal. And then this album came out. And this was the one that kind of, I was going to say broke the internet, but of course they didn't have the internet then. That was another thing. And you know what? We seem to get along fine without it. But this was the one that was the Born Again Christian album, or that's the way it was perceived. One thing I will say is I'm not going to sit here and try to analyze Bob Dylan. I did a video on Cat Stevens converting to Islam, and I was a little sheepish about doing that, but if you can watch it and see my thoughts. And I'm even more hesitant to say anything about Dylan. He's raised in Judaism, Robert Zimmerman, I guess most people know that. And I don't think you would characterize him in this period as a messianic Jew. I don't know. Like I said, I don't want to characterize anything, but the other interesting thing is he started going, it was the end of the 70s, and he started going to a vineyard church in California with the woman. I think he just broke up with Sarah. There's that great song, Sarah, is it Desire? Sarah, Sarah. That Dylan voice, so lovely to look at, so hard to define. It's a great song. But I think their marriage had kind of broken up, and he was hanging around with another woman who was a member of this vineyard church. And I actually know a little bit about that too, because in this period I knew some people that were in the vineyard church, and which wasn't even really a church. I mean, what I remember is they met in people's homes. I think there was a growing vineyard type church in California, and it was just kind of a ethos or an approach, really. I don't think it was like a denomination or anything. But I did know some people that would talk back in that period about the Vineyard Church. And I remember one of the really cool things about the Vineyard Church was they had really good music. And there was a pretty good Christian music in the 70s. I have this album. I've actually got a couple of his albums. I just fished this one out. This is Larry Norman, Upon This Rock. Now, there were a number of Christian rock artists like Randy Stonehill, Larry Norman, Phil Keaggy, who's got to be one of the best guitar players around, obviously, and some others, Second Chapter of Acts. And I grew up hearing all those. I never thought a lot of them, I didn't listen to them as much. I have some of their albums, but I never thought the production quality and some of the overall music, if you have a choice between listening to the Eagles or Led Zeppelin or some of the awesome music of the mainstream, and some of those Christian rock albums of that period maybe were, not of that quality, but they were pretty good. And the other thing about a lot of these artists that kind of makes me think a little bit of Dylan is they weren't necessarily Christian artists. They were artists who sang from a Christian perspective. So they were these albums were kind of like Dylan or Neil Young type albums. You heard a lot of acoustic guitars, harmonicas, guitar solos, and they were very much kind of hippie Christianity, which I always liked. One interesting observation I would have about that, and I think this is also true of the Vineyard music, is in the 80s, a lot of that music, people got a hold of it in business and they turned it into praise and worship, which was kind of marketed in a lot of Christian bookstores. And I used to play piano. I still do play piano in church, but I remember in the 90s going into like Lifeway Christian bookstore, and they had all that praise and worship music, and I never really took to it too much. And it reminds me a little bit of like Nashville, all the great music that Nashville had in the 70s. And then business people came in probably from out of town, and they turned it into a big business. And I don't think Nashville's ever been quite as good. Not that there isn't good country music out there. But Christian music in the 70s was actually pretty good. I don't know what Dylan had in mind, but that Vineyard Church actually had some pretty good music. And the people I knew were very authentic, down-to-earth, intelligent, sincere people. And, I think Bob Dylan has always valued authenticity. I think, he left Manhattan, in 65 or something. He was playing in Greenwich Village in the kind of folk scene, which he was great. And he kind of left that, and he seemed kind of disenchanted with it. Like, I think you can hear that in that one song he does, Leopard Skin Pillbox Hat. And he went south, which is also kind of a departure. If you think he went south in the mid-'60s, right in the middle of the civil rights movement, and he started hanging around playing with people like Charlie Daniels, Norman Blake, and a bunch of other people that were very Southern, because I think he likes authentic people. And I also think he likes good music. And the Slow Train Coming is a really good album. And I think he likes good music. I noted in 2009 he did a Christmas album, and it's got not only kind of the secular Santa Claus type Christmas music on it, but also, some of the Christmas carols. I think "Hark the Herald Angels Sing" and some songs like that. I think his version of "Here Comes Santa" must be one of the best, worst Christmas carol renditions of all time. I shouldn't say that, but it's great. Bob Dylan sings Christmas carols. For some reason, you don't hear that album on the radio with Perry Como and Andy Williams and Karen Carpenter too much all December. But it's actually a pretty good album, but it's definitely a Dylan album. But I think he likes authentic music, and that and there's a lot of great traditions of authentic music. This album is actually pretty interesting. He came out with this was the first album, and then he had these follow-ups: "Shot of Love" and "Saved." "Shot of Love." What do we got here? Looks backwards to me in here. "Shot of Love" and "Saved." But this is, and they're all pretty good albums, but this is the big one. And you notice it's kind of cryptic. You've got sort of a workman working on a railroad, the slow train coming, and his pickaxe looks kind of like a cross. And on the back, you have a telephone pole, a kind of Wichita lineman photo of a telephone pole, which also kind of looks like a cross. But one thing, this isn't a lot of overt, Christianity like, "Blessed Assurance" or "Calvary, He Died for Me." The songs are kind of elusive. There are songs on here that you could almost maybe think he was singing about a woman, but he's actually singing "I Believe in You." I was listening to that last night in the car. And you'd think, well, if you didn't know any better, you just think he was singing about a woman he loved or something. And just the context, and everybody says this is a Christian album, so you think he must be singing about his faith or God, but it's not specific. There's not a lot of stuff about the road to Calvary or anything like that on here. But it's a really good album. "Gotta Serve Somebody," that's the one you always heard on the radio, which is an excellent song. "Precious Angel," that's really nice. And you know who? Again, as is always the case, he's got a really good band, and there's a young Mark Knopfler on here, and there's good, nice kind of classic Strat guitar all through this album, and that's Mark Knopfler. And so if you want to hear some early Mark Knopfler, it's a really good example of Mark Knopfler, and it's a very good album from this period. I think the album he came out with after this was called "Infidels," which is Dylan, and I remember this period because at that time, kind of like now, I was involved in a church. I actually, even at that time, I would play guitar in church and stuff, and my family was raised in a church, so a lot of the people I knew and loved were from a church, and I was also friends with a lot of people who played music, and definitely met a lot of people in school that had a lot of the anti-religion views, which didn't seem as vitriolic as they are now, but they were definitely around. And so I remember, like, when this album came out, like even like little old ladies in our church would say, "Isn't that nice, Bob Dylan?" And they didn't know who Bob Dylan was, but they just knew he was a famous rock star like Mick Jagger or something. He's come to the Lord, and so you'd hear stuff like that, and you might even see church groups try to go to his concerts, and I don't think his concerts changed all that much. I mean, his concerts were still pretty much the Last Waltz variety of rock and roll show, and but that was kind of nice. But then you had, I think, a certain amount of people. He could have been a drug addict or he could have converted to Satanism or something, and it would have been better than having him convert to being a born-again Christian. That word isn't used much anymore, I notice. It's kind of a 70s word. I think it does have a taint to it. But this is a good album, Shout of Love. It's got Ronnie Wood on it. It's definitely a fine album. But this was the one that you always heard. But I definitely remember those concerts where, like, when he first did that, you'd have people a lot of the people I knew, and I think this was true all over the country, that were had a church background. They thought Bob Dylan was going to kind of cut his hair and come to church and, and be like a repentant sinner, and they were going to show their support, in the Christian way. And I don't think Dylan ever really came around to that approach, and I don't think he said all that much about it. But, I always respect Dylan, and I think he's always searched for authenticity, and I think that's what he found, and his music's always been authentic. And this, the other thing, there's a lot of, you got songs in here that are kind of like spirituals, like God Gave Name to All the Animals. That sounds like an old African-American spiritual. When He Returns, that's really beautiful. It's got some nice piano on it. When You Gonna Wake Up? Gonna Change My Way of Thinking. That's kind of a rocker. It kind of reminds me of Baby Let Me Follow You Down, which is on the Last Waltz. So it's just a flat out good Dylan album. Don't let any of the religious baggage scare you off. It's a good Dylan album, and it's an interesting period in his life. It only lasted a few years, and who knows, what what he's thinking or whatever. But one thing, it definitely left an interesting little space in his discography that, and particularly this Slow Train Coming is just, where is it? Particularly this Slow Train Coming is just a really fine album. And it was played a lot on the radio, on rock radio. That's the other thing, too. I don't think you would have heard it much on Christian radio. And Christian radio back then wasn't contemporary Christian. Christian radio back then, you would have heard a lot of, like, Back to the Bible and, Bill Pierce on trombone. And you might not even hear much Floyd Kramer. There was kind of a litany of pre-approved Christian piano players. Cliff Barrows used to sing for Billy Graham. You'd hear a lot of that stuff on Christian radio, and so there wasn't, and like a lot of this Larry Norman stuff was there was nowhere to play it because they didn't really have radio stations to play. Maybe some Christian colleges would play stuff like this, actually. But for the most part, it was kind of under radar. And Dylan never really entered into like, oh, let's put him in the rotation with Christian artists doing Old Rugged Cross, it was. But I think when this first came out, because I'm old enough to remember that, I think that's how some people perceived it. Oh, Bobby Dylan, now he's going to come to church in a tie and, give his testimony to everybody about he was saved from rock and roll or something, that never really happened. And within a few years, he was on to other things. But he did leave a good album. And who knows, what he was thinking or whatever. And, but you always got to respect someone, and when they leave true good music, that speaks for itself. By their fruits ye shall know them, to quote the good book. And the other thing I will say is this album came out right as music was changing. And one thing, whatever else you say about Bob Dylan, some of his albums are better than others. He never went formula rock. He never went disco. If he did anything, it was always because he wanted to do it and he liked to do it, and it connected with him, and I'm assuming he wanted it to connect with his audience. But he never made any of these calculations like a lot of classic rock artists did going into the 80s. Maybe he didn't have to. Maybe his situation was different because he was such an iconic figure already. He was Bob Dylan, but he never sold out, quote unquote. And this album is not a sellout. It's not any kind of a calculation or a marketing move. It's just a good album, and that's where he was at that time in his life. That Vineyard Church, like I said, I think it kind of grew beyond its roots, but its roots were in that old hippie Christianity of the 70s, which I remember pretty well because like church camps and things when I was a kid were a lot like that. They were very kind of hippie, organic. You hear lots and lots of guitar and a kind of positive faith message, at least, so what I was exposed to. It was, a more traditional type of American Christianity, but it was not a particularly political message, and it was definitely a positive faith message. And they definitely had a lot of good Christian music in the 70s, and I never really thought the praise and worship people, whoever ran that, which was probably a marketing thing more than anything else, I always thought the music was diminished. But if you look at the 70s, there was some pretty good Christian music. And I don't even really know if Dylan belongs in that category, because he never stopped being a classic rock artist, the FM album-oriented rock artist. But it is a good album, and it's a good period of Dylan's life and music. And thanks. God bless.